On March 18, 1925, a monster tore across 3 states in less than 4 hours, and most people never saw it coming because the sky was too thick with dirt and debris to even know what was happening until it was already on top of them. This is a video to listen to while driving, working, cleaning, walking, or getting things done. It's made for people who enjoy learning and listening, not for those expecting a highly edited or fast-paced documentary. Just relax, listen, and enjoy the story. So let me tell you about the Tri-State Tornado. This wasn't just any tornado. This was the deadliest tornado in United States history. And honestly, when you hear the details, you'll understand why it still holds that record almost 100 years later. It killed nearly 700 people. It injured thousands more. It completely erased entire towns from the map. And the scariest part? It moved so fast and stayed on the ground for so long that people barely had time to react. We're talking about a tornado that traveled over 200 miles without lifting back into the clouds. That's not normal. Most tornadoes touch down, do their damage, and then disappear back up into the storm. But this one? It just kept going and going, like it had a mind of its own and a mission to complete. Let me paint the picture for you. It's the middle of March in 1925. Spring is just around the corner, but the weather is still unpredictable. People in Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana are going about their daily lives. Kids are in school, farmers are working their fields, shopkeepers are selling goods. It's a Wednesday, just a regular midweek day. Nobody is expecting what's about to happen. And here's the thing. Back in 1925, there was no weather radar. There were no tornado warnings sent to your phone. There were no meteorologists on TV telling you to take cover. People relied on looking at the sky and hoping they'd notice the signs in time. But with this tornado, even that didn't help because the storm was wrapped in so much rain and dirt that you couldn't see the funnel until it was practically on top of you. Now let's talk about how this whole thing started. The day began with weird weather. Temperatures were unusually warm for March. It was humid, sticky, the kind of air that makes your clothes cling to your skin. The sky had this strange greenish tint to it, which, if you know anything about tornadoes, that's never a good sign. But again, people back then didn't have the knowledge we have now. They didn't know that green skies often meant hail and severe storms. They just thought it looked odd and went on with their day. By early afternoon, storms started popping up. There were reports of heavy rain, lightning, and strong winds. But storms in the Midwest weren't unusual, especially during the transition from winter to spring. So most folks just hunkered down and waited for it to pass. Except this storm wasn't going to just pass. It was building something much worse. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the tornado touched down in the Missouri Ozarks, near a town called Ellington. Right from the start, this thing was massive. We're not talking about a little funnel that kicks up some dust and knocks over a few trash cans. This tornado was estimated to be over a mile wide in some places. Imagine that. A wall of wind and debris more than a mile across, moving at over 60 miles per hour. That's faster than most cars could drive on the roads back then. The tornado didn't care what was in its path. Trees were ripped out of the ground like they were weeds. Houses exploded into splinters. Barns were lifted and tossed hundreds of feet away. And the worst part, people inside those homes didn't stand a chance. The tornado would hit so fast that they'd barely have time to realize what was happening before the roof was gone and the walls were collapsing. Ellington was one of the first towns to get hit hard. It was a small mining community, not a lot of people, but enough that everyone knew each other. The tornado tore through the town and killed several people right off the bat. Homes were destroyed. The local school was damaged. Survivors described hearing a sound like a freight train mixed with a roar that felt like it was coming from the earth itself. And that sound, that's something almost every tornado survivor talks about. It's this deep, rumbling, roaring noise that you feel in your chest as much as you hear it. Some people said it sounded like 1,000 trains all running at the same time. Others said it was like the earth was screaming. Either way, once you heard it, you knew something terrible was happening. After Ellington, the tornado kept moving northeast. It crossed the Mississippi River, which is a natural border between Missouri and Illinois. Now, crossing a river might slow down or break up a normal tornado, but not this one. It didn't even flinch. It just kept going, tearing through the countryside, flattening farms, killing livestock, and leaving a path of destruction that looked like a war zone. Farmers who survived said they came out of their storm cellars to find their entire property gone. Houses, barns, animals, crops, everything was just wiped clean. Some described it as if a giant eraser had come through and removed everything from the land. The ground was scoured so badly in some places that the topsoil was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but bare rock and dirt. When the tornado entered Illinois, it was moving at about 60 to 70 miles per hour, maybe even faster at times. This is important because speed matters. The faster a tornado moves, the less time people have to react. And this tornado wasn't just fast, it was also incredibly violent. Scientists today estimate that it was at least an F5 tornado, which is the highest rating on the Fujita scale. That means wind speeds were over 200 miles per hour. At that speed, anything not bolted down is going airborne. Cars, tractors, pieces of buildings, all of it becomes deadly projectiles. There are stories of 2x4 pieces of wood being driven through tree trunks like spears. There are accounts of straw being embedded into telephone poles. That's how powerful the winds were. One of the hardest hit towns in Illinois was a place called Gorham. Gorham was a small railroad town, a few hundred people, a main street with shops and homes, a school, a church, the usual setup for a rural town in the 1920s. The tornado hit Gorham around 2:30 in the afternoon. School was still in session. Kids were sitting in their classrooms. Teachers were giving lessons. And then, in a matter of seconds, the school was gone. The building collapsed. Some children were killed instantly. Others were buried under rubble. Teachers tried to shield students with their own bodies. It was chaos. Parents who survived the storm in other parts of town came running to the school, digging through the wreckage with their bare hands, screaming for their children. Some found their kids alive. Others didn't. It's one of those moments in history that's almost too painful to think about. But it's important to remember because it shows just how devastating this tornado was. Gorham was almost completely destroyed. Out of the few hundred people who lived there, nearly half were either killed or seriously injured. Entire families were wiped out. Homes were reduced to piles of sticks. The main street was unrecognizable. Survivors said it looked like a bomb had gone off. And in a way, It had. A tornado of this size releases energy equivalent to a nuclear explosion. The damage it caused was absolute. There was no such thing as a partial hit. If the tornado touched your property was gone. After Gorham, the tornado continued northeast, ripping through more small towns and farms. It hit Murfreesboro, which was one of the larger towns in its path. Murfreesboro had a population of around 12,000 people, so it wasn't a tiny village. It was a real town with businesses, schools, hospitals, and homes. The tornado struck the town in the middle of the afternoon. Again, people were going about their day. Some were at work, some were at home. Kids were in school. And then the sky turned black, the wind picked up, and everything went to hell. The tornado carved a path of destruction right through the heart of Murfreesboro. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. The business district was destroyed. The hospital was damaged, which made it nearly impossible to treat the flood of injured people that came pouring in. Bodies were laid out in the streets because there was nowhere else to put them. Survivors wandered around in shock, covered in dirt and blood, looking for family members. Murfreesboro lost over 200 people that day. It was the single deadliest tornado strike on a community in the entire event. Families were torn apart, children were orphaned, homes, businesses, and lives were destroyed in a matter of minutes. And here's something that makes it even worse. Because the tornado was moving so fast and was so wide, people didn't have a clear idea of what was happening. There was no funnel cloud visible in the sky that they could point to and say, "That's a tornado, we need to take cover." Instead, it was just this massive, dark, churning wall of wind and debris that swallowed everything in its path. People described it as a black cloud that rolled over the town. By the time they realized it was a tornado, it was too late to do anything but hold on and pray. The tornado didn't stop at Murfreesboro. It kept going. It hit the town of DeSoto, another small community in Illinois. DeSoto had a school, and just like in Gorham, the tornado hit while school was in session. The school building collapsed, killing dozens of children and teachers. It's hard to even imagine the horror of that moment. 1 second, kids are sitting at their desks, maybe daydreaming about going home or playing outside. And the next second, the walls are coming down and the roof is caving in. Parents who rushed to the school after the storm found a pile of rubble where the building used to be. They dug through the debris, pulling out bodies, some alive, some not. It was a scene repeated in multiple towns that day, and it's a big part of why the death toll was so high. Schools were particularly vulnerable because they were big buildings full of people, and construction back then wasn't designed to withstand tornadoes of this strength. After DeSoto, the tornado continued its rampage. It moved into Indiana, still on the ground, still tearing up everything in its path. By this point, it had been on the ground for over 3 hours. 3 hours. Most tornadoes last a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 if they're really strong. But this one just kept going. It was like it was feeding off the storm, gaining strength instead of losing it. In Indiana, it hit the town of Griffin, which was almost completely destroyed. Then it hit Owensville, and then Princeton. Each town suffered massive damage. Homes were destroyed. People were killed. The tornado left a trail of death and destruction that stretched across 3 states and over 200 miles. By the time the tornado finally lifted back into the clouds, It was nearly 4:30 in the afternoon. It had been on the ground for about 3.5 hours, which is an incredibly long time for a tornado. In that time, it traveled 219 miles, killed 695 people, injured more than 2,000, and destroyed 15,000 homes. Those numbers are staggering. Even today, with all our technology and warning systems, a tornado that's strong and that fast would cause massive damage. But back in 1925, when people had no warning and no way to see it coming, it was a complete catastrophe. Let's talk about what happened after the tornado passed. The destruction was so widespread that it was hard to even know where to start with rescue and recovery efforts. Communication was difficult because phone lines were down, roads were blocked by debris. Entire towns were cut off from the outside world. Survivors were left to dig through the rubble on their own, looking for family members, neighbors, and friends. In some towns, there were more dead than living. Bodies were pulled from the wreckage and laid out in rows because there was no place to put them. Makeshift morgues were set up in whatever buildings were still standing. Churches, schools, even barns became temporary hospitals and morgues. Help did come, but it took time. The Red Cross mobilized quickly, sending in volunteers and supplies. Doctors and nurses from surrounding areas came to help treat the injured. But there were so many injured people and so few medical supplies that doctors had to make terrible decisions about who to treat first. People with minor injuries had to wait while those who were critically hurt were treated. Some people died waiting. It was a nightmare scenario. And on top of the physical injuries, there was the emotional trauma. People had lost their homes, their families, their entire way of life. Some survivors said they wished they had died in the tornado because they didn't know how they were going to go on without their loved ones. In the days and weeks after the tornado, stories started to come out. Stories of survival, stories of heroism, and stories of heartbreak. There were people who survived by hiding in storm cellars or basements, only to come out and find that everyone they knew was gone. There were stories of parents who died shielding their children. There were stories of teachers who gave their lives trying to protect their students. There were also stories of amazing survival. People who were picked up by the tornado and carried hundreds of feet, only to be set down relatively unharmed. One man was reportedly carried over a quarter mile and lived to tell about it. Another person was found alive in the rubble days after the storm, trapped under debris, but still breathing. But for every story of survival, there were dozens of stories of loss. Entire families were wiped out. In some cases, there was nobody left to bury the dead because the whole family was gone. Communities came together to help each other. Neighbors who had lost everything shared what little they had with others. People donated money, food, clothing, and supplies. The recovery effort was massive, but it was also slow. Rebuilding took years. Some towns never fully recovered. Some people never returned. The trauma of that day lingered for generations. Now let's talk about why this tornado was so deadly. There are a few factors that came together to make this the worst tornado disaster in American history. First, the size and strength of the tornado. This was an F5 tornado, the most powerful category. The winds were strong enough to completely level well-built homes and toss heavy objects like cars and tractors. Second, the speed of the tornado. It was moving at over 60 miles per hour, which meant people had very little time to react. Even if they saw it coming, they might only have had a minute or two to find shelter. Third, the path length. This tornado stayed on the ground for 219 miles. That's an insane distance. Most tornadoes lift after a few miles, but this one just kept going, hitting town after town. Fourth, the time of day. The tornado hit in the early afternoon when people were at work, at school, or at home. Schools were in session, which is why so many children were killed. If it had hit at night, the death toll might have been even higher because people would have been asleep and unable to see it coming. But hitting during the day meant that a lot of people were in vulnerable places like schools and businesses. Fifth, and this is a big one, the lack of warning. In 1925, there was no such thing as a tornado warning. Meteorologists didn't even fully understand how tornadoes formed. The word tornado was actually banned from being used in weather forecasts because officials didn't want to cause panic. Can you imagine that? They literally weren't allowed to warn people about tornadoes. So when this storm started developing, there was no way to alert the towns in its path. People didn't know what was coming until it was on top of them. Today, we have weather radar, tornado sirens, weather apps on our phones, and TV meteorologists who can track storms in real time. Back then, they had none of that. They had to rely on their own eyes and ears, and with this tornado, that wasn't enough. Another factor was the construction of buildings. In 1925, most homes were made of wood. They weren't built to withstand high winds. There were no building codes that required reinforced structures or storm shelters. Basements were common in some areas, but not everywhere. In rural areas, many homes didn't have basements at all. People might have had a root cellar or a storm cellar outside, but if they didn't make it there in time, they had no protection. The tornado could rip a house apart in seconds, and anyone inside was at the mercy of the wind. Modern building codes and construction methods have made homes much safer, but back then, a direct hit from a tornado meant almost certain destruction. The aftermath of the tri-state tornado led to changes in how we think about and respond to tornadoes. It became clear that people needed some kind of warning system. It took a long time and a lot of bureaucracy, but eventually, tornado warnings became a thing. Meteorologists started studying tornadoes more closely, trying to understand how they form and how to predict them. Technology improved, radar was developed, communication systems got better. By the time we got to the mid-20th century, the government had established the tornado warning system that we use today. It's not perfect, but it's saved countless lives. If the tri-state tornado happened today, the death toll would likely be much lower because people would have advance warning and could take shelter. But even with all our technology, tornadoes are still incredibly dangerous. Every year, people are killed by tornadoes in the United States. We can't stop them, and we can't always predict exactly where they'll hit. All we can do is watch the weather, listen to warnings, and take shelter when needed. The tri-state tornado is a reminder of just how powerful nature can be and how vulnerable we are when we don't have the tools and knowledge to protect ourselves. Let's talk about some of the specific stories from that day, because numbers can only tell you so much. The real impact of the tornado is in the individual stories of the people who lived through it. In Murfreesboro, there was a woman who was at home with her 3 children when the tornado hit. She heard the roar, grabbed her kids, and tried to get them to the basement. But before they could make it down the stairs, the house exploded around them. She was thrown across the yard, and when she woke up, she was buried under debris. She could hear her children crying, but she couldn't move. She was pinned. Neighbors eventually found her and pulled her out, but by then, 2 of her children were dead. The third was severely injured and died a few days later. She survived, but she lost everything: her home, her children, her husband who had been at work and was also killed. Stories like that were common. People who lost their entire families in a matter of seconds. In DeSoto, there was a teacher who saw the storm coming and tried to get her students to safety. She herded them into the hallway, which was supposed to be the safest place in the building. But when the tornado hit, the roof collapsed and the walls came down. She was killed, along with most of her students. A few survived, buried under rubble, and were pulled out by rescuers hours later. One boy said he remembered his teacher covering him with her body, and that's the only reason he lived. She took the impact of the debris and saved his life, but she didn't make it. Acts of heroism like that happened all over the affected areas. People putting others before themselves, trying to save as many as they could. In Griffin, Indiana, there was a family that survived by hiding in a storm cellar. They heard the tornado coming and ran outside to the cellar. They made it inside just in time, slamming the door shut as the wind picked up. They huddled together in the dark, listening to the roar above them. They could hear things hitting the door, banging and crashing. It sounded like the whole world was being torn apart. And then, after what felt like forever, it went quiet. They waited a few minutes, too scared to move, and then slowly opened the door. When they came out, their house was gone. The barn was gone. The fields were destroyed, but they were alive. They said it felt like a miracle. They had nothing left, but they had each other, and that was enough. Not everyone was that lucky. There were families where nobody survived. Entire households were wiped out. In some cases, the only way to identify bodies was by the location where they were found because the injuries were so severe. The tornado didn't just kill people, it mutilated them. Bodies were found with limbs missing, crushed by debris, or so battered that they were unrecognizable. It was a gruesome scene, and it took a toll on the rescuers and survivors who had to deal with it. People talked about the smell, the sight of bodies laid out in the streets, the sound of people crying and calling out for loved ones. It was traumatic in a way that's hard to put into words. The economic impact of the tornado was also huge. Entire towns were destroyed, which meant the local economy was destroyed too. Businesses were gone. Farms were ruined. People lost their jobs because the places they worked no longer existed. In 1925, most people didn't have insurance, or if they did, it didn't cover tornado damage. So they had no way to rebuild. They lost everything and had no financial means to recover. The Red Cross and other charitable organizations helped as much as they could, but there was only so much they could do. Some people left and never came back. They moved to other towns, other states, trying to start over. Some stayed and slowly rebuilt, but it took years. The scars of the tornado, both physical and emotional, lasted for decades. Let's talk about the science of the tri-state tornado for a minute, because it's actually really interesting. For a long time, people debated whether it was actually one continuous tornado or a series of tornadoes from the same storm system. The debate happened because it's extremely rare for a tornado to stay on the ground for that long and travel that far. Most tornadoes have a life cycle. They form, they reach peak intensity, and then they dissipate. The whole process usually takes less than an hour, but the tri-state tornado was on the ground for 3.5 hours. That's not normal. Some scientists thought it might have been a family of tornadoes, meaning one tornado would dissipate and another would form right behind it, creating the appearance of one continuous tornado. But more recent research suggests it really was one single tornado. Surveys of the damage path show a continuous track with no breaks, which supports the idea that it was one long-lived tornado. So, how does a tornado stay on the ground for that long? It has to do with the structure of the storm that produces it. The tri-state tornado was part of a supercell thunderstorm, which is the most powerful type of thunderstorm. Supercells have a rotating updraft called a mesocyclone, and that rotation is what spawns tornadoes. If the conditions are right, a supercell can sustain a tornado for a long time. The storm needs a constant supply of warm, moist air feeding into it, and it needs wind shear, which is when wind speed or direction changes with altitude. The tri-state tornado had all of those conditions. The atmosphere was extremely unstable that day. Warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico was colliding with cooler, drier air from the north. That created the perfect setup for severe weather. The storm was able to tap into that energy and keep the tornado going for hours. Another factor was the forward speed of the storm. The whole storm system was moving fast, and the tornado moved with it. That's why it was able to cover so much ground in such a short time. Most tornadoes move at around 10 to 20 miles per hour. The tri-state tornado was moving at over 60 miles per hour. That's incredibly fast, and because it was moving so fast, people had almost no time to react. By the time they realized what was happening, the tornado was already there. Imagine trying to outrun something moving at 60 miles per hour. You can't. Your only option is to find shelter immediately, and even then, there's no guarantee you'll survive if the shelter isn't strong enough. The width of the tornado was also unusual. Estimates vary, but at some points the tornado was over a mile wide. That's massive. Most tornadoes are a few hundred feet wide, maybe a quarter mile at most. But this one was a monster. A mile-wide tornado means the area of destruction is huge. It's not just one house or one block that gets hit. It's entire neighborhoods, entire towns. And because it was so wide, people on the edges of the path might have thought they were safe, only to be hit by the outer circulation. The tornado didn't need to be directly over you to cause damage. The winds extended far beyond the visible funnel. One thing that made this tornado particularly terrifying was its appearance. Witnesses said it wasn't a classic funnel cloud. Instead, it looked like a huge, dark, boiling cloud that stretched from the sky to the ground. It was wrapped in rain and debris, which made it hard to see. Some people described it as a black wall or a rolling fog. That's why so many people didn't realize it was a tornado until it was too late. They saw the dark cloud and thought it was just a bad storm. By the time they saw the debris flying and felt the wind, they had seconds to react. In some cases, they didn't even have that. The tornado was on top of them before they knew what was happening. After the tri-state tornado, there was a push to better understand tornadoes and improve warning systems. But it took a long time. It wasn't until the 1950s that the first tornado forecasting system was put in place. Even then, it was limited. Meteorologists could say that conditions were favorable for tornadoes, but they couldn't pinpoint where or when one would form. It wasn't until the development of Doppler radar in the 1990s that we really got good at detecting tornadoes. Doppler radar can see rotation inside a storm, which means meteorologists can spot a tornado forming before it touches down. That gives people precious extra minutes to take shelter. Those extra minutes save lives. Today, when a tornado is detected, the National Weather Service issues a tornado warning. That warning goes out over TV, radio, weather apps, and outdoor sirens. People know to take shelter immediately. Most communities have designated storm shelters, and schools have tornado drills. We've come a long way since 1925, but even with all that, tornadoes still kill people every year. In 2011, a tornado hit Joplin, Missouri, and killed over 150 people. It was a terrible tragedy, and it showed that even with modern warning systems, tornadoes are still incredibly dangerous. If people don't take warnings seriously, or if they don't have a safe place to shelter, they're at risk. The tri-state tornado is a reminder of how important it is to respect the power of nature. Tornadoes are one of the most violent forces on Earth. They can destroy anything in their path. Concrete buildings, steel structures, vehicles. Nothing is truly safe in the strongest tornadoes. The only way to survive is to be prepared. That means knowing what to do when a tornado warning is issued. It means having a plan and a safe place to go. It means not waiting until the last second to take action. Every year, people die because they didn't take a tornado warning seriously. They thought they had time, or they wanted to see the tornado, or they didn't think it would hit them. But tornadoes are unpredictable. They can change direction. They can intensify suddenly. The best thing you can do is take every warning seriously and get to safety as fast as possible. Let's talk about some of the myths and misconceptions about tornadoes, because there are a lot of them, and some of them are dangerous. One common myth is that tornadoes don't hit big cities. That's not true. Tornadoes can and do hit cities. It's less common because cities take up a relatively small amount of land compared to rural areas, but it absolutely happens. There have been tornadoes in Dallas, Nashville, Atlanta, and many other cities. The idea that a city is somehow protected is false and can lead people to let their guard down. Another myth is that you should open your windows when a tornado is coming to equalize the pressure. This is not only wrong, it's dangerous. Opening your windows wastes precious time that you should be using to get to safety. The pressure change from a tornado is not what destroys buildings. It's the wind. Your house is going to be destroyed by the wind, whether the windows are open or not. So don't bother with them. Just get to your safe place. Another myth is that overpasses are safe places to shelter during a tornado. This one is particularly dangerous because people have died following this advice. In the 1990s, there was a video of a news crew taking shelter under an overpass during a tornado, and they survived. That video got shown a lot, and people started to think overpasses were safe, but they're not. In fact, they can be more dangerous than being out in the open. The wind gets funneled under the overpass, creating even stronger winds. And if you're under an overpass, you're blocking the road, which can trap other people who are trying to escape. If you're driving and a tornado is coming, the best thing to do is to get out of your car and lie flat in a ditch or low area, covering your head. It's not ideal, but it's better than being in a car or under an overpass. There's also a myth that the southwest corner of a basement is the safest place during a tornado. This idea came from old observations that tornadoes usually approach from the southwest. So people thought the northeast corner of a building would be hit first and debris would be blown to the southwest. But tornadoes can come from any direction, and debris can fly in any direction. The safest place in a basement is the center, away from windows, under something sturdy like a staircase or a heavy table. If you don't have a basement, the safest place is an interior room on the lowest floor, away from windows. A bathroom or closet is often a good choice because the walls are reinforced by plumbing. Now let's talk about some of the long-term effects of the tri-state tornado. The immediate impact was death and destruction, but the effects lasted much longer. Communities were changed forever. Towns that were hit hard took years to rebuild, and some never fully recovered. The population of some towns dropped significantly because people left and didn't come back. The economic impact was felt for a generation. Families who lost everything struggled to get back on their feet. Children who survived grew up with trauma. They had nightmares. They were afraid of storms. Some carried that fear for the rest of their lives. The survivors who were adults at the time often didn't talk about it much. It was too painful. But the memories stayed with them. And they passed those stories down to their children and grandchildren. Even today, almost 100 years later, there are families in Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana who have stories about the tri-state tornado passed down through the generations. The tornado also had an impact on how we think about disaster preparedness. It showed that we needed better warning systems, better building codes, and better emergency response plans. In the years after the tornado, there was a push to create a national weather service that could track storms and issue warnings. That eventually became the National Weather Service we have today. Building codes were updated to require stronger construction in tornado-prone areas. Emergency response procedures were developed so that rescue efforts could be coordinated more effectively. The lessons learned from the tri-state tornado helped save lives in future disasters. But despite all the improvements, tornadoes are still a major threat. Every year, the United States sees more tornadoes than any other country in the world. We're in what's called Tornado Alley, which is a region in the central part of the country where conditions are often right for tornadoes. That includes states like Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, Nebraska, and Missouri. But tornadoes can happen anywhere in the United States. They've been recorded in all 50 states. Some areas are more prone than others, but no place is completely safe. That's why it's so important to be prepared and to know what to do when a tornado warning is issued. Let's talk about some of the science behind tornado formation, because it's actually pretty fascinating. Tornadoes form from severe thunderstorms, usually supercells. A supercell is a thunderstorm with a rotating updraft. That rotation is caused by wind shear, which is when wind speed or direction changes with height. When you have strong wind shear, it can cause the air to start spinning. If that spinning air gets tilted upward by the updraft, it creates a rotating column of air inside the storm. That's the mesocyclone. If conditions are right, the mesocyclone can tighten and extend down to the ground, forming a tornado. Not all supercells produce tornadoes, but when they do, the tornadoes are often strong and long-lived. The ingredients for a tornado are moisture, instability, lift, and wind shear. Moisture comes from warm, humid air, usually from the Gulf of Mexico in the United States. Instability means the atmosphere is unstable, with warm air at the surface and cooler air aloft. That creates rising air, which is the updraft. Lift is something that forces the air to rise, like a cold front or a dry line. Wind shear provides the rotation. When all those ingredients come together, you get the potential for severe weather and tornadoes. Meteorologists look for these conditions when forecasting severe weather. If they see all the ingredients in place, they'll issue a severe thunderstorm watch or a tornado watch, which means conditions are favorable for tornadoes to form. If a tornado is actually detected, either by radar or by a trained spotter, they'll issue a tornado warning, which means take shelter immediately. One of the challenges with tornadoes is that they can form very quickly. A storm can go from looking relatively benign to producing a tornado in a matter of minutes. That's why it's so important to pay attention to watches and warnings. A watch means be ready. A warning means take action now. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand the difference, or they ignore warnings because they've heard them before and nothing happened. But every warning should be taken seriously, because you never know when it's going to be the real deal. The tri-state tornado is a perfect example of what can happen when people don't have warning or don't take it seriously. Hundreds of people died because they didn't know the tornado was coming or didn't have time to take shelter. Another interesting aspect of the tri-state tornado is how it compared to other tornadoes in history. In terms of death toll, it's still the deadliest tornado in United States history. No other tornado has come close. The second deadliest was the Natchez, Mississippi tornado in 1840, which killed over 300 people. The third was the St. Louis tornado in 1896, which killed over 250 people. But the tri-state tornado's death toll of nearly 700 is in a category by itself. In terms of path length, it also holds the record. 219 miles is the longest tornado track ever recorded. Most tornadoes travel just a few miles. Even strong tornadoes usually don't go more than 10 or 20 miles. But the tri-state tornado just kept going and going. It's an outlier, a freak of nature, something that we hope never happens again, but know that it could. In terms of width, the tri-state tornado was also exceptional. A mile wide is extremely rare. There have been other very wide tornadoes, like the El Reno tornado in Oklahoma in 2013, which was over 2.5 miles wide. But those are the exception, not the rule. Most tornadoes are much narrower. The combination of size, strength, speed, and longevity made the tri-state tornado a perfect storm of destruction. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and the result was the deadliest tornado disaster in American history. It's also worth noting that the death toll could have been even higher if the tornado had hit more populated areas. Much of the path was through rural farmland, where the population density was low. If it had gone through a major city, the death toll could have been in the thousands. That's something to keep in mind when we look at modern tornado risks. A tornado like the tri-state tornado hitting a city like St. Louis or Chicago today would be catastrophic. Even with modern warning systems and building codes, the death toll could be enormous. That's why meteorologists take tornado forecasting so seriously. They know that the potential for disaster is always there, and their job is to give people as much warning as possible so they can get to safety. Let's talk about some of the human stories of resilience and recovery after the tornado, because it's not all doom and gloom. Yes, the destruction was immense, and the loss of life was staggering, but people are resilient. Communities came together to help each other. Neighbors who had lost everything shared what little they had. Strangers traveled from other states to help with rescue and recovery efforts. The Red Cross set up relief stations and provided food, water, and medical care. Churches and community organizations organized fundraisers to help survivors rebuild. It was a massive effort, and it showed the best of humanity in the face of tragedy. There were stories of people who lost everything but refused to give up. Farmers whose land had been scoured clean by the tornado started over, replanting crops and rebuilding barns. Business owners whose stores had been destroyed set up shop in temporary buildings and slowly rebuilt. Families who had lost loved ones found ways to carry on, honoring the memory of those they lost by rebuilding their lives. It wasn't easy. It took years. Some people struggled with grief and trauma for the rest of their lives, but they kept going. They found a way to move forward. There were also stories of communities coming together in ways that hadn't happened before. The tornado didn't discriminate. It hit rich and poor, black and white, young and old. In the aftermath, social barriers that had existed before seemed less important. People helped each other regardless of background or status. It was a moment of unity in the face of shared tragedy. Of course, that unity didn't last forever. Once the immediate crisis was over, old divisions resurfaced. But for a time, people saw each other as fellow human beings in need, and they responded with compassion and generosity. The tri-state tornado also had an impact on popular culture and collective memory. It became a part of the folklore of the region. Stories were told and retold. Songs were written about it. Newspapers covered it extensively, though, of course, the coverage was nothing like what we'd have today with instant news and social media. But people remembered. Memorials were erected in some of the affected towns. Every year on the anniversary of the tornado, there are remembrances and ceremonies. Survivors and their descendants gather to honor the memory of those who were lost. It's a way of making sure that the tragedy is not forgotten, that the lessons learned are passed down, and that the people who died are remembered. In some towns, there are museums or historical societies that have exhibits about the tornado. They have photographs, artifacts, and personal stories. Visiting those exhibits is a powerful experience. You see pictures of the destruction, and it's hard to believe that a natural event could cause that much damage. You read the stories of survivors, and you're struck by their strength and resilience. You see the names of the dead, and you realize that each name represents a person with a life, a family, dreams, and hopes that were cut short. It's a sobering reminder of the power of nature and the fragility of human life. Now let's talk about what we can learn from the tri-state tornado. The most important lesson is the value of preparation and awareness. Tornadoes are a natural part of life in much of the United States. They're going to happen. We can't stop them, but we can be ready for them. That means having a plan for what to do when a tornado warning is issued. It means knowing where your safe place is, whether that's a basement, a storm shelter, or an interior room on the lowest floor. It means having supplies on hand, like water, food, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. It means paying attention to the weather, especially during severe weather season, and it means taking warnings seriously. Another lesson is the importance of community. When disaster strikes, we need each other. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers helping strangers. That's what gets us through. The response to the tri-state tornado showed that when people come together, they can overcome even the most devastating challenges. That spirit of community and mutual support is something we should carry with us, not just in times of disaster, but in everyday life. A third lesson is the importance of science and technology. The improvements in tornado forecasting and warning systems since 1925 have saved countless lives. We can track storms in real time. We can see rotation inside a storm before a tornado forms. We can issue warnings that give people time to take shelter. But we can always do better. Research into tornadoes continues. Scientists are working on better ways to predict when and where tornadoes will form. They're studying the structure of tornadoes to understand what makes them so destructive. They're developing better building materials and designs that can withstand high winds. All of that work is aimed at reducing the death toll from future tornadoes. A fourth lesson is the need for better building codes and infrastructure. Many of the deaths in the tri-state tornado happened because buildings weren't strong enough to withstand the winds. Today, we have building codes that require certain standards in tornado-prone areas, but not everywhere. And even in places with good building codes, older buildings may not meet those standards. There's a need for retrofitting older buildings and ensuring that new construction is as safe as possible. Storm shelters should be more widely available, especially in schools and public buildings. In some states, there are programs that help homeowners install storm shelters, but more could be done. Every life saved is worth the investment. Finally, the tri-state tornado teaches us humility. We like to think we have control over our environment, that we can tame nature with technology and engineering. But tornadoes remind us that nature is still more powerful than we are. We can prepare, we can build stronger, we can warn people, but we can't stop a tornado. We can't control the weather. All we can do is respect the power of nature and do our best to protect ourselves and each other. As we wrap up this story, it's important to remember the people who were affected by the tri-state tornado. Nearly 700 people lost their lives. Thousands more were injured. Entire communities were devastated. Behind every statistic is a person, a family, a story. They deserve to be remembered. Their experience should serve as a reminder of the importance of preparedness, the value of community, and the need for continued improvement in how we predict and respond to tornadoes. The tri-state tornado was a tragedy of almost unimaginable scale. It's hard to comprehend the level of destruction and loss, but it's also a story of survival, resilience, and the strength of the human spirit. People who lost everything found a way to rebuild. Communities came together to support each other. Lessons were learned that have saved lives in the decades since. The memory of the tri-state tornado lives on, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the endurance and courage of the people who lived through it. If you found this story interesting, go ahead and check out another one on the channel.